us. So Carrie's going to share her story, and please hold. We should hold questions until you're finished, do you think?
I don't think there'll be a lot of questions. Everyone will be like...
Probably that's true. So I'm going to just suggest, unless it's a burning question that you'll forget, let's wait until Carrie's finished. And I will try hard to remember to give you a little time for first questions there, and then I may make a response, or we may just bounce off of your questions, which would be wonderful.
So thank you all for, I don't know if you've all been here all day, but I know it's a long day, and I appreciate your staying. As John said, this was not sort of what I planned to be here for originally, but we got to talking, and I said, oh, you know, I have a story that changed my life about forgiveness, and so that's why I'm here to share with you today. And I really hope that as I'm telling my story and afterward that you'll be thinking about, you know, questions you have about forgiveness, what it brings up for you. I think this is like a really rich topic, and I would love for the major part of this session to be an exchange with all of us. So without further ado, I will plunge into my story. I'm going to take you back to the early 80s. I was at the beginning of my journalism career. I was working in New York City for the New York Times as a sports writer, and I was covering pro basketball. Yes, me and the 7-foot behemoths were hanging out together. So I was covering, I actually was the lowest person on the newspaper, on the sports desk. And so I got the least coveted beat, which was covering the New Jersey Nets. And I don't know if there are any basketball fans out there, but in the early 80s, the New Jersey Nets were like the bottom rung. They didn't even have their own stadium. It was that bad. But I was traveling around the country with them when they played, you know, at other stadiums. So I was on a road trip, western part of the country. It ended up in Salt Lake City, and as it happened, my younger sister, Meg, I have 4 sisters and 1 brother, but she's the next one down from me. She was living in Montana, and she was getting married to her long time high school, junior high. I think they started going together when she was 12 or something like that. But they were finally going to get married, and as it happened, the timing worked out for me to finish my road trip, fly up there for their wedding. And so that's what I did. So they had this wonderful wedding in a mountain, you know, lodge with wildflower centerpieces, and they had a wonderful band. And I don't know how many of you know me, but I've been a dancer all my life, and I love to dance. So, of course, after the ceremony, they had a great reception, fun band. People are dancing. I'm looking around for who I can dance with. And there's this guy on the dance floor who's a pretty good dancer, and he is dancing with another woman. So I went to my sister and I said, who is that? And she said, oh, that's Hal. He's Chip was her husband, really good friend. And I said, and who's he dancing with? And she said, that's his sister. And I was like, great. So I went and asked him to dance, and we had a wonderful time, and I flew back to New York City and my job, and we continued to correspond, and long story short, I ended up leaving my job in New York City and moving to Montana. And my younger sister, who had been living there, Meg, and her husband, actually, by the time I moved out there, had moved to California. So they were no longer there. But I moved to Montana, and, you know, a year later, we were married on a sailboat in Hawaii. It was about as perfect wedding as you can imagine. We eloped. And a year after that, I was pregnant. And I had, my son was born in 1984. And he had a lot of issues right from the beginning. He had, just a lot of physical challenges, and nobody could really determine what all the problems were, but it was, definitely a challenging time as a new mom with a baby who had issues, and we spent about the first 2 years of his life going around to specialists and trying to figure out what the issue was. I mean, that's a whole nother story, and we never really did find out his diagnosis until he was in high school, because it hadn't even been discovered yet at the time that he was born. But anyway, suffice it to say, it was kind of a challenging time, and at the same time, we were building what we thought would be our dream house on the foothills of the Sandia Mountains, a beautiful area outside of Bozeman, Montana. And so here I am starting my new life in Montana with my new husband and my new baby. And there were, definitely some rocky periods, just because there were a lot of worry about my son and a lot of stress in building a house and so forth. But anyway, when my son was about 2 years old, I had been pretty much staying home and taking care of him. And my husband, who happened to be a falconer, I'm not even sure if everybody knows what a falconer is, but someone who has a falcon and goes out and hunts with the bird. But he would often take off for the weekends and, drive to various parts of Montana to fly the falcon. And for the first couple of years of my son's life, I didn't go with him because the baby was so small, and it just wasn't very practical. But at one point, he said he was going away for the weekend to go fly the bird, and I said, why don't we come with you? It's been so long, and it would be really great to have this time together, and we've, had a lot of challenges. And he reacted really out of the ordinary in saying that he didn't think it was a good idea for us to come. And then it was sort of like, well, I really need this time for myself. And there were all these things that kind of raised a lot of red flags for me. And so he ended up going off for the weekend by himself. I ended up calling my older sister, Tracy, who at the time was my, best friend in the world and my confidant, and who lives on a very isolated ranch in New Mexico. And I called Tracy and I said, I'm really, I don't know what's going on, but something's going on. I'm not feeling right about this. And, I wanted to go with Hal this weekend, and he made all these excuses, and I don't, I feel like I don't trust what's happening. And there was this long silence. And then she said to me, well, I hate to be the one to say this, but Meg, my younger sister, the one who had moved to California with her husband, called me 2 days ago and said, will you cover for me? I'm going away for the weekend, and if Chip calls, I'm telling him that I'm coming to the ranch. I'm not actually coming to the ranch, but will you cover for me if he calls? So by this time, I put two and two together. I knew that he and Meg had been very close friends, before Meg got married. And so by the time he came home from his trip that weekend, I confronted him, and as it turned out, he was having an affair with my younger sister. Needless to say, this was shocking and just terribly painful. And for a couple months, I lived under the delusion that somehow I was going to save this marriage. Even though Meg and Chip broke up, Meg moved back to Montana, and they continued to see each other. I somehow was going to will this to work out until it became very evident that I did not have the ability to, save the relationship. And so filed for a divorce, which also made me angry because he wouldn't file for the divorce. I ended up having to file for the divorce, and I was like, I don't even want the divorce, and I'm having to file for it. Anyway, we were divorced sometime later, within the next year, and he and Meg moved in together, and they were living in the town next to the town that I lived in, and we had shared custody. And that I remember as, probably one of the most painful times of my life, because I had this baby who had issues, who I had devoted my life to for 2 years, and every other weekend the two of them would come and pick him up and take him with them, and my son was the only thing I really had at that point, or the only thing I felt like I had at that point. That was sort of the beginning of my casting myself in the role of a victim. And I'm not saying I wasn't a victim. In some ways, I was. I mean, obviously, this was not something that I had chosen or that I had initiated. But I remember going to a counselor and the counselor saying, well, express your anger to me about this whole thing. And I remember saying, I'm not angry. I've never been angry. I'm hurt. I'm crushed. I'm destroyed. I've not only been betrayed by my husband, I've been betrayed by my sister. And needless to say, there were repercussions through my whole family. As I said, I have a large family, 6 kids. My parents were both still living at that time. And obviously, it's very difficult within the whole family because the whole family doesn't really know how to deal with it. I do remember being angry at my parents that they didn't come rushing to my defense, which they didn't. And it took me many years to understand what a difficult situation they'd been put into to have this happening between, 2 of their children. But, time goes on. You continue your life. You pick up your life. You do the best you can. I felt that I went through a lot of counseling. I felt that I was moving on. I started a dance studio. My son was doing better, physically. I ended up moving down to New Mexico where my older sister lived and being, close to family again. And I really felt like, I was moving on with my life. But somewhere within me, I was still holding on to that feeling that I had been wronged and that I was the victim in this. And as the years went by, and this was a period of about 10 years, I realized that I was still really struggling to be happy. And meanwhile, I was seeing my sister Meg and my ex-husband loving being together and building a wonderful life together. And it was awkward with the family. For a number of years, they stayed away from family functions just because it was so difficult. For a number of years, when my son was too young to fly by himself, I used to fly him to see his dad, drop him off, stay in a hotel for the weekend, and then pick him up and fly him back. So I really, really worked hard to try to make sure he could maintain his relationship with his dad. But it was still very painful, and I still really hadn't moved on. I didn't date anyone. I kind of dove back into work again when I moved to New Mexico and got back into journalism. And about 10 years down the line, I had a friend who had done a workshop. I don't know if anyone's heard of it, called the Landmark Forum. It's like I think it was actually an outgrowth of Esalen, where you or Est, sorry, where you go for a long weekend. You really examine your past. It's all about letting go of your past and the stories that you have created about your past, so that you can open yourself up to the possibilities of a more fulfilling life. So I had a friend who was involved with the forum, and she, for years, had been trying to get me to go and get me to go and get me to go, and I was resistant. I was like, I've already dealt with all that. I'm over it. It's in the past. I've let go of it. At this point, I've even gone to some family functions where my sister and my husband also participated. Wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't horrible. But finally, she talked me into going, and I went through this intensive 3 or 4 day process of looking back and examining all of the stories you've created about what has happened to you. And one of the final steps of the process was that you had to write a letter to whoever you felt, you were incomplete with. And so I ended up writing a letter to my sister and my husband, and very honestly telling them the impact that their decision had had on my life, and how I felt that I had been held back, not necessarily just by their decision, but by my reaction to it, and how I realized that the only person that was being hurt by it now was me. I was the one who was still suffering from an inability to let go and forgive them. And so I forgave them in this letter. I read the letter to all of the people in the group, which was very cathartic. And then I sent the letter to my sister and her husband. And that began a process for me that truly changed my life. I realized in some way that there was a love I could give and I could have that was bigger than my love for any individual person. And that in forgiving them, I was freeing myself to be open to that. And I'm not going to kid you, it was not immediate. I didn't send off this letter and then all of a sudden, call them up the next day and say, hey, let's get together and go on vacation. Or, it was still a process. I truly had forgiven them, and there truly was a great weight lifted from my shoulders when I did that. I don't know. People ask me, well, how did you do it? How did you, truly let go? I don't know. I can't tell you that. All I can tell you is that at that point I was ready. And this was, as I said, this was 10 years in, so it was definitely not a fast process. And they had, I neglected to say they had gotten married when my son was about 14. Well, I guess that was about the same time that this all happened. They may have gotten married just after I sent the letter. But every year things got a little bit easier. Every year we were more in communication. My son ended up having some very serious mental health problems in his early 20s. And we were able to co-parent, and I was so grateful to have someone else helping me through that. And I began to learn that my life could be so much fuller if I could instead of resenting them or being victimized by them, I could love them. And I do love them. My sister and my ex-husband are two of the people I'm closest to in the world. 2 days from now or 3 days from now, I'm leaving to fly to Montana where they live to spend a month with them, going hiking, going kayaking. They have been an incredible help to me in raising my son through some really difficult years. We still make jokes about it. Every year we celebrate Auntie-Mother's Day because my sister is my son's aunt and also his stepmother. So we have a special Auntie-Mother's Day song we sing to her every Mother's Day. And, we make jokes about it. But we adore each other and we would do anything for each other. And my life and my son's life are immeasurably better for my having been able to forgive them. And so it really was a turning point in my life. I think about love differently than I used to. I forgive more easily. I understand the benefit of forgiveness, not only to the person who has wronged you, but to yourself. And so it really, I've gone through a lot of things in my life. I've had, a son with mental health issues. I've had cancer twice. I've had a lot of challenges, but I would say that my experience in coming to forgiveness with them is probably the thing that most changed my life. So I just share that with you as an example of the power of forgiveness, and I would love to open this up to everybody, to your thoughts, your reactions. Melissa has some great questions that we can take off from here if we want to, but it's a huge subject, and I still get the reaction when I don't go around telling this story all the time. And actually, it's one of the most of you know that I'm a journalist and I write for the Herald Tribune. This is one of the few stories that I have not told in writing. And this is actually only the second time that I've told it in a public setting. But most of my friends know, and sometimes when I meet someone new and they'll ask about why I'm not married or where my son's dad is or whatever, I'll explain. And the reaction is always like, "You gotta be kidding me. Are you out of your mind?" And I just somehow want people to understand that, yeah, I know it's shocking, it's incredibly hard, but I feel like the gifts I've gotten back from being able to do it have been so much greater than anything that I gave up. So I'm going to just let Melissa take over here.
Thank you, Carrie, so much. It's quite a story that Carrie has to share, and I love her attitude about forgiveness and how she's so clear to say that it's not something that just bingo, it's done. Just because I decide it's done, that doesn't mean it's done. We have to live the decision out. And that's one thing that I think comes across very clearly. Thank you. I'd like you guys for just a minute to think about first someone that had some transgression against you or you against them, but the forgiveness has happened, and the relationship is smooth. And just reflect, kind of think, feel in your body what that's like to know that that's in place after there's been a transgression. So just sit with that for, I'm going to say a minute, probably 20 seconds. And let yourself ease from that position into a place where there's some situation in your life where it's not settled. Either you need forgiveness, or especially if there's a place where you know that you're being hampered because you haven't gotten to the place inside where you can think very much about forgiveness, let alone offer it. And that has a different feeling inside. And that feeling is a marker for, am I making any progress on this issue? Is it even an important issue to me that I forgive? And that's a good place to start thinking about Carrie's story and what she shared about what was important for her, and also about your stories. Now, I want to be clear, nobody has to share anything today. If all you want to do is ask questions, that's perfectly fine. But kind of having that feeling inside is a good place to launch from. So we're not going to pass the microphone. It's a little too cumbersome, but if you want to just raise your hand or just ask.
Hi, thank you so much, Carrie, both of you on this. What really struck me is I'm in a variety of 12-step programs, and one of the things that we always talk about when you're working through, your past is resentments that you have, which can be people, places, things, or whatever, and they always define resentments as you taking poison and expecting somebody else to die, which is really, really true. But although a totally different platform, what you were doing, okay, what you were doing to a certain extent was at least a little bit of that, looking at it, examining it, and understanding that it was obviously harming your relationships with those folks as well as just tearing you apart. So that's one of the things we work with on, a variety of issues or problems to get a little bit of spirituality and comfort. But you're right, it's not here are the amends I have to make to whatever 10 people. Oh, no more resentments, they're all gone. It's a process, and I think time has a role in it as well. So that's all for me.
Did you? I've got another one.
Oh, you have another one. Yes. Yeah, so true. And one thing that I didn't really emphasize was I got so comfortable in that role of being the victim that I think that I didn't feel like I deserved to be anything other than a victim. That was my role. I liked it when people felt sorry for me, and I sort of got into that whole, it's kind of very sick in a way, but yeah, so it took time for me not only to get used to having a relationship with them again, but for me to realize that that didn't have to be my identity.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be our identity, and also for there's so many reasons why we might need to offer forgiveness for people at different times in our lives. And one of the things that clients often ask me is, well, if I forgive them, doesn't that mean I'm saying it's okay? No, no, it doesn't. It doesn't mean you have to go lay yourself down in front of the bus again. Sometimes people have to be out of your life in order for you to have a safe life. You can forgive and not still have someone in your life. So the whole gamut is possible.
I probably won't need that. Can everyone hear me all right? Thank you for sharing. I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more about, besides your relationship with your ex-husband and your sister, how that forgiveness, how that affected your life beyond your relationship with your ex-husband and your sister. How did forgiving them expand your life and make your life more fruitful in other areas?
Thank you. That's a great question. Well, one thing that it did was also change the dynamic within our family. So that was the more immediate effect. I remember about maybe 5 or 6 years after we got divorced, one of my siblings coming to me and saying, you know, you really got to get over this because we are never going to be able to have a family gathering again if you don't move on, you know. And that made me angry. You know, that was like, you stand in my shoes and you try it, you know. But in fact, when I was able to do it, our family was able to, you know, come back together and share wonderful times together, thankfully, before both of my parents died. I think it also just made me, this sounds really weird, but more willing to be vulnerable, almost more willing to be heard. Not that I was asking to be heard, but more willing to, you know, let my heart be out there and let my love show, even if I wasn't sure what the reaction was going to be. And certainly it made me more quick to forgive in many lesser situations. And you know, I've been on the other end too. I've done things where people have been angry with me and not granted me forgiveness. And I know how hard it is to be on that end, especially if you did something inadvertently or you did something that you very much regret or feel badly about. It's torturous to be in that situation of wanting someone's forgiveness and having them withhold it. So I think on both ends of the spectrum, I'm just, I don't know, my sisters say I'm a lot easier to get along with now.
And I think another part of answering that question, or related to the question you were asking, sir, is that what we know medically now is that when we hold on to bitterness, pain, resentment, any of those negative emotions, it has a bad effect on our health. When we offer forgiveness, to stay with that because it's been studied a little bit more now than some of the other emotions, blood pressure goes down, blood sugar can stabilize, we're happier people, we don't tend to be as troubled by depression and anxiety. So if all of those things happen to me because I forgive something, then that has ramifications that I don't even have to name in my relationships because I'm feeling better. I'm a better person. For me, I'm more congruent in my relationship with God if I'm offering forgiveness. So it's very, very powerful individually as well as for a community. Think what it would be like if we really had a community that practiced the art of forgiveness. I mean, we do have those communities, but I think we need to shout them out a little bit louder.
I'm not sure I totally answered your question, sir, but you know, I think, you know, and I mentioned this briefly before, it changed it changed who I am and who I want to be. I like myself much better now. I'm a much kinder person. I'm a much more generous person. I'm a much more patient person. I truly believe that there is a love greater than romantic love, greater than, you know, love for any one particular person. I don't even know really how to put it in words, but my heart is much bigger than it used to be. I'm like the Grinch who, you know, my heart grew 3 sizes in one day.
Christy, and then the lady behind you.
It's good to be able to let everyone hear, though.
It was brought up today, the epidemic of loneliness. And so I'm wondering your experience of loneliness and how that was changed by forgiveness, or has it?
I can answer mine on a personal level. You're talking about loneliness after my divorce. You know, I guess I'm fortunate in a way in that I've always had sibling support. And I was so consumed by raising my son on my own while still working and having a career that I really did not get lonely a lot. And I have now been divorced for, let's see, how old is my son? So I've been divorced for 35 years. I haven't really had a serious relationship in all of that time, which is probably not the most healthy thing, but I missed a lot of years in there, you know. What was I going to say? I'm not lonely at all, ever. I mean, I hate to say that, and part of that is my son is still very much in my life, because even though he's in his 30s, he still needs some support. And so I've always had, you know, that constant in my life. And I've now been alone for so long and lived alone for so long, because my son doesn't live with me, that no one would want to be with me anymore, because I am very solidly independent, and that would be a very hard adjustment for me to make. So I think the combination of being very consumed with what I had to handle in my life, and having, you know, I always had some sibling and family support that was invaluable. And so I'm really fortunate, and wonderful friends. I have great friends too.
I'd just like to say one thing, and then I know that you had a question. Speaking to the loneliness thing, though, Christy, I mentioned in the panel that I see mostly seniors, and it was difficult for a lot of them during the pandemic. But your question triggered for me the memory of one person in particular who was very bitter about things that had happened before the pandemic, you know, life things where people could actually get together and have fights and disagreements and stuff. And so it wasn't obvious at first, but the therapy became about, really, was she ever going to forgive and let go of these things that had happened? And she was magnifying the loneliness of her relative isolation by not forgiving. And the story isn't over yet, but so it shows up in that way. Yeah. And you had a question. Yeah.
Hi. So my question is, what practical steps would you tell someone who's very early in the forgiveness process? I know from just like personal experience of my friends who have walked through getting a divorce and someone telling them very early on, well, you're going to have to forgive him. And she was like, I'm not ready to forgive him. They're like, well, but the Bible tells you need to forgive him. So in a more practical sense, how would you suggest someone get to that place where they can forgive and it be genuine?
That's a really great question. Yeah, and the genuine part is especially good, because it's really not very hard to say, I forgive you. And it's like, no, you don't, you know, not really. I hope I have never said to anyone, you have to forgive or you have to do it on a certain timetable, because you don't. You know, you can live and grow increasingly aware that you're a little bit miserable and eventually figure it out, and you've spent 10 years being pretty miserable. You still don't have to forgive if you don't want to. But when you step onto the path, or someone wants to step onto the path of, I think this is holding me back, I try to stay right there with them for a while until they can really flesh out what's holding them back. What does it feel like? Why do they want it? Why don't they want it? Which is increasing? And then it doesn't always require the other person's participation, but I think if it can happen that way, there's a more immediacy to the experience of forgiving someone. So that's how I would start. And I don't do, there's workbooks and stuff on forgiveness. Personally, I don't use them. I'm sure many of them are wonderful, but to me it's a softer process than that. It needs space, it needs safety. For big issues, your issue, you mentioned that you got help in processing that stuff. I think often it's therapy of some sort, counseling, a spiritual director, a priest, pastor, something extra is needed so that we don't get scared and harden ourselves. What does this mean? I don't want to let go of that anger. I don't want to let go of that hurt. I just don't want to. Well, that's a space, but it's not a healthy place to stay. So I don't know if I answered your question enough, but okay. Bill?
A comment and then a brief personal sharing. I echo the gratitude for your openness and transparency. You model what I heard our speaker advocating earlier this afternoon. Melissa, you asked us to reflect on our own journey, and immediately came to mind a parallel but different experience. Someone had physically wounded me. They were deceased, and I began a journey of forgiving them. I can identify with what you said about before you forgave. And as a pastor, I've dealt with people who are still angry and unforgiving of someone who had died, which when I tried to excuse it, well, they're not alive, there's nothing I can do about it. And it took some counseling and a lot of struggle to forgive this person. And we've continued to have a relationship, I think a pretty good one. So forgiveness takes many forms. And if I heard you correctly, it was about 10 years before you, mine was about 30 years. And yet it didn't cripple me, but there was still something inside of me that was choked up. So again, thank you.
Thank you for sharing, Bill. Anybody else have a question or comment?
Hi, I want to thank you. It was a fascinating story and just so heartfelt. I guess mine is, forgiveness is something that I've read a lot of research studies on, and I work with a lot of clients that deal with domestic violence. One of the studies that comes up, and it is somewhat personal to me as well, is that especially for women that are in intimate partner violence, ones that are quick to forgive have a higher rate of welcoming their abuser back. And that's something that I have struggled with. Because where is that boundary of forgiving and being quick to forgive and then allowing that hurt? And I understand that it's almost two separate things, because I like what you said is, you still have to have boundaries. But then even when you get out of that space, how then do you kind of get back to that place where you are quick to forgive? Because there is a fear there. Kind of where are the boundaries? Where is the trust? And, how do I not let something like this happen again? I don't know if any of this makes any sense, but
it does make sense, yeah.
Well, one thing I would say, and obviously that's a very different situation than my own, and I am very fortunate in that my ex-husband is really a wonderful person and was willing to walk this journey with me. And but I think in many cases that in a situation where domestic violence is involved or something, I'm not sure that the forgiveness is true conscious forgiveness. I think it's more wanting to go back to the comfort level, wanting to go back to wanting the disruption to be over. I think the reason why it took me 10 years and why it stuck after 10 years was that on every level, this was bigger than just saying, I forgive you, So I think there's maybe some, differentiation in that way too. And I'm not even sure how you tell somebody what that differentiation is, or what genuine, forgiveness is. It's much more of an internal thing than an external thing that you're saying to the person you're forgiving.
Yeah, I think that's accurate too, Carrie. I know even in my own life, there's layers to forgiveness. And if somebody tells someone, for example, in a domestic violence situation, well, you're going to get through this and then you've got to forgive that person, or you're not a Christian, or you're not this, or you're not that. That is re-traumatizing, right? And so that's not the case. We may say, I forgive you, just so we can look the person in the eye again and continue to work things out. We may never say that. The forgiveness may happen only internally, right? And it releases us. Forgiveness, I think, is largely for the forgiver, not the forgivee. It changes my life. If I don't choose to live with bitterness and disappointment and sorrow, I don't have to. But I may have to forgive the person who caused some of those things in my life. Does that address your question? Okay, thank you. I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah. Thank. Yeah. Well, I don't know if you'd agree with this, Carrie, but I think once you put yourself on the path of forgiving people, you're kind of on that path. It changes your life orientation. And so that makes it easier.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think all I have to do is look at what my forgiveness of my husband and my sister has done for my life. My son has 3 parents who adore him and who support him. I have these wonderful, family members who support me and help me through all my challenges. I feel so grateful that I was able to forgive, because I wouldn't have had any of that. My son probably wouldn't have even had a father presence in his life. And, we all love each other so much, and we all enjoy each other's company so much. And, when I look at it now, I'm sure I wouldn't look at it this way right after we were divorced, but I'm like, oh hell, the divorce is not a big deal. I still have these people in my life. We still have a loving relationship, like who cares about the marriage part? Which oversimplifies it. But I'm just saying that I feel like I was so fortunate to be able, I hear all the time stories of people who are feuding with their exes 10, 20, 30 years after they're divorced, and kids who lost contact with the parent because of the feud. And my own brother has not spoken to one of his children for 20 years because of a very difficult divorce from his first wife. And I feel incredibly sorry for him, because I just can play out in my mind what my life would have been like had I not been able to do this. And I'm just so grateful that I could.
Thank you.
Hey there, I was just curious, did your sister and ex take responsibility for their part in hurting you and apologized to you?
They did. You know, we've never actually sat down together and had a conversation about it. They did write me back a letter after the letter that I wrote to them. And, you know, those were, while they were letters that really provided a lot of release, they were also really painful letters because they weren't just like, you know, I forgive you and let's all be friends. I mean, it was like, you really changed my life. You really changed my son's life. This was, you know, not how I envisioned things going. But yes, they did take responsibility. I know, not necessarily from specific conversations we've had, but that things that have occurred over the years. I know that my ex-husband carries a lot of guilt still, and feels, you know, really badly about his absence from my son's life. And I don't want him to feel that way. That's something, you know, that he feels. But yeah, I would just, yeah, just leave it at that.
That's good. Thank you. I think that that highlights something, though. One thing we learn in the process of forgiveness is what belongs to the other guy. I can't do that person's work. I can only do my work. And I think that's really...
Exactly, and I think that when you know, when I know that he's feeling something, triggers something so that he's feeling badly, I actually feel bad for him, but that he's got to work that out. That's part of his process.
Yeah.
I would just say thank you for acknowledging the process and that it took time. I actually had a client that fired me once because I couldn't give her the 1, 2, 3, 4 of forgiveness for her brother. At the end of I mean, she didn't want to forgive him, but she knew she was supposed to, and she wanted me to give her the handbook for it, and I kept telling her it was a process. So in the storytelling, I think for people who are sitting on that line of I'm supposed to do this, it's really helpful to hear that it really was quite the journey. So thank you for that and for your vulnerability.
Comments or questions? Yeah?
So I'm curious what you think, how much of what you've benefited from forgiveness is a result of your ex-husband and your sister's response to your forgiveness, and how do you think you would have had the same feeling, like would you have had as much release if they had not responded well to your forgiveness?
Can I respond to that? This is with a general statement, but I think it speaks to that question. I talk with my clients about don't offer forgiveness until you can do it without expecting anything back. So if I'm going to forgive someone, especially some serious, egregious, you know, I want to know that I'm so clear that no matter how they react or if they react even, it's not going to change what's going on with me. So I just generically, I wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think that it would have definitely been more difficult for me and more painful for me had we not been able to establish, you know, a relationship. I can't imagine that I wouldn't have felt sad about that. At the same time, really, like Melissa said, when I finally got to the point that I could let it go, it was so liberating for me. And so even if they had responded in that way, I don't think that it would have made, you know, a huge difference to me other than it would have made me sad that it couldn't be more.
That's good. Thank you. I don't know where we are on 41, I think 4 minutes. 4 minutes. Who wants to get the last question or comment in?
I guess I want to relate what happened in my family. As the middle person in a dispute, the family plays a role that they probably don't even realize. My niece and her mother, for whatever reason I never did know, simply didn't talk to each other. They didn't talk to each other for 20 years. But they told me they were delighted that I would be with them and talk with them, and so I was there. I never did anything intermediate. I simply was there until about 6 years ago. One of them finally asked, well, what have you heard about my mother? Well, I told her what I heard about her mother. And every once in a while they'd ask a question, and they'd start getting a little more interested in what each other were doing. And finally one day, to my total amazement, because my sister and I only talk at Christmas and Easter, she called and said, would it be all right if I talked to DJ, my daughter? I said, yeah, call him up. Well, when do you think? I said, get on the phone and call him right now. She did. They apparently had a 4-hour conversation from what they told me, and they have been talking to each other every Sunday since then. So when my sister celebrated her 100th birthday, her daughter went out to be with her. So my point is, the family may not know what in the world is going on, but you have to be extraordinarily patient with it and not push and not ask. Just be there for them. Thank you.
Thank you so much for bringing that story up. Mary Beth, you had a question.
It wasn't really a question. I just want to thank you again, Carrie. I read your column. I love it. And to hear your story is such a blessing in this situation that we're talking about with forgiveness, and so powerful. I just want to, it's funny, I'm agreeing with what you're saying, and that was going to be my comment. What I heard you say loud and clear, Carrie, is that when your sibling said, you really need to get over this and move on, that's really counterproductive to the forgiveness process. And I think as therapists, we have to keep that in mind very clearly, that it's their process. It's like grief. It's their process. There's not a timetable. There's not a magic formula that's going to get them through it. And we just have to be there with them and be patient and respectful and honor their process. And so, yes, thank you very much. That's all I really wanted to say.
Thank you.
I was just going to say, sadly, what I have seen is the closer somebody gets to the end of their life or the projected end of their life, the more I see forgiveness, the more I see people understanding, I don't want to die with this unresolved. And if there was some way for people to understand all the years that they're losing, you know, that's why I tell this story. I lost 10 years, really, of my relationship with them. But I'm so fortunate that I've had, 20 more years or more, of a wonderful relationship. So if you have someone in your life that you're unresolved with, don't wait till you're on your deathbed.
I can vouch for that.
I know you said you haven't put this in print, but in one of your columns, have you talked about the principles of forgiveness, maybe without the details of the story, or would that be something that maybe...
I haven't. This is one story that I've been sort of saving for my memoirs, so if I live long enough, you can all buy a copy.
I wanted to say, because it kind of fits in with this, about 4 or 5 years ago, I wrote an article for, I don't know, a Samaritan or a church publication or something, and it was titled The Power of Forgiveness. That dropped completely out of my mind, and I think John Gregory, titled this The Power of Forgiveness. And I even talked with Carrie, and I said, I don't know if that's the best title for this, and yet that's the title, and I found that yesterday. I found that article that I had written. So, magical things happen. Okay, Carrie, thank you so much for being here. We do need to wrap up.